the wicked. So he doesn't like it. It's not natural to him in the sense it's not what he wants. And you can take that and you think about the death of even the wicked. Now you think, certainly as people, obviously, we are also wicked. We commit sins, but yet we are his people. And if he doesn't even take pleasure in the death of the wicked, he certainly takes no pleasure in the death of his people. And as you look in our text, even in verse 12, as God looks down from heaven and he sees these wolves taking the sheep, biting them, devouring them, scattering them all over the place, God doesn't like these wolves attacking them and devouring them. And he wants to put an end to this idea of death in the world. So he wants to get rid of it. And the reality is, God hates that all of us are going to die. And every one of us, unless Jesus returns, are one day going to die. And you can just even think about, just even recently, I was just thinking about this morning. If I go all the way back to like 2020, I know just in that year, I knew 3 people that died that year. Some of you know a lot of people that died just this last year in 2024. Think about all the loved ones that we have had to say goodbye to, that are on their deathbeds, and we've had to say goodbye to at the hospital, or say goodbye to at home, or on hospice, or whatever. And then they go away, what we think is forever. Even little kids, and you take about just even the innocence of a little kid. There are many kids that have to, that end up having some kind of horrible, painful disease and end up dying itself. And we can say that God hates that. God wants a world where people are praising his name and loving him. He doesn't want a world filled with hospitals and graveyards. And so he wants to get rid of death. He wants to get rid of sin that destroys his creation, and he wants to get rid of the death that ruins his creation as well. Now, I love Isaiah. Isaiah does talk about the world as being this giant graveyard, but then he switches the subject up and he goes, oh, wait, it's actually not a graveyard. It's a pregnant woman that's going to give birth one day, and talking about resurrection. I think that's just a great image. But he wants to get rid of graveyards. He wants us to not even remember that a hospital needs to exist. Yet they do exist right now. And yet in verse 10, Jesus says that he came that we may have life and have it abundantly. So he's coming now. Death is in the world, sin's in the world, and now Jesus is coming to give us life and give it abundantly. So my question for you is, love motivated God to give us life in creation, but now after the fall, now that sin and death in the world, God is still a life giver and he still wants to give us life. But how is he going to give us life now that sin and death exist? What is going to motivate him now? Is it the same thing, or does it look any different? How does God give us life after sin and death enter the world? Now, this is my next question. Okay, so the next question I have, there's a slide for it. Before we get to that question, I want to ask the question of how we maintain life with God to begin with. So God gives us life in creation. How do we maintain that life, or how is Adam supposed to maintain that life with God? So after God originally gave us life, what was expected of us to maintain life? So last week, during the snowstorm, I go to the backyard and I let my dogs out. About 10 minutes go by, I open the door, and I'm yelling, "Shadow, bear," and they don't come back in. I go to the front gate, I look, go to the front of the yard, and the gate is wide open. Somebody, I don't know who it was. We didn't do it. We don't ever open the gate to let them out. Somebody came up and opened our gate, and they had gone, and they were gone. Now, let's just say that somebody else isn't going to take them in and take care of them. What are the chances that my dogs would survive leaving our house? You know, obviously, we are their source of life. We give them food. We give them shelter, water. What are their chances of survival out apart from us? Yeah, very slim. Very slim to none, right? And it's because we are their source of life. When you cut yourself off from the source of life, you can expect to die. And this is what God is, there's different ways we can talk about death. We can talk about it as a penal punishment. Certainly that is true. Yet at the same time, God is the only source of life. You can't get life anywhere else. I don't care where you go. You cannot get life anywhere else except from God. He's the only one who can give life to all things. And so if you cut yourself off from him, you should die. And that's what happened in the garden. Adam and Eve were expected to, do you think that they were expected to love God in the garden? Yeah. We'll talk about obedience and stuff in a second, but the way that they were to maintain the life that God had given them was to maintain a loving relationship with the source of life. In order to maintain life, you have to maintain a loving relationship with the only one who can give you life, with the only one who has life. And so they are expected to stay connected to God, stay in a relationship with God. And yet, they sinned. They failed to love him perfectly, and they were cut off. And now, all of us now are under the sentence of death because all of us are born under the seed of Adam, and he was our representative, and all of us now are under death. And so you can see this. Now, obedience, I want to make this very clear. When we talk about obedience isn't like, it's not earning life. Obedient, because of our relationship with God, right? He's God, we're creatures. Because of that relationship, obedience isn't what earns life, it's the fruit of someone who loves God, right? The way that you can look out at people and know if they love God is if they obey him. Obedience is the fruit of loving God. Jesus says, if you love me, you will, what? You will keep my commandments. This is all through out the scriptures. When they came and talked to Jesus and about the law and the prophets, Jesus says, all the law and the prophets it hangs on this. Love God and love your neighbor. What's the idea? If you love God, you can even just say love God, but if you love God and you love your neighbor, you're going to obey, right? That's the point. You're going to do what he says. So obedience is the manifestation of a heart that loves God, right? And this is, I think, what one of the problems with the Pharisees is. They just want to obey, but it's not it's not motivated by love or any relationship they have with him. It's just trying to like rule, keep, and earn life their way and on their terms. So that's and as we go with this, when we think about if loving God and which is manifest in obedience, if that's what's required to maintain life, how do you think you've done? Yeah, all of us have failed to love God, and all of us have failed to obey God. And so every single one of us, even this morning before you got here, you have failed to love God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your strength. And so now what that means is that how many times did it take for Adam and Eve to not love God, to be kicked out the garden, out of God's presence, and gone forever, under the death sentence forever? One time. How many times in our life have we failed? Can't even, like 10? No, more than that, right? No, can't even count. Can't even count. It's a lot. Innumerable. 10 times in an hour. So all of us fail to love God. And so what are you going to do? You are under the death sentence, and yet Jesus is coming. I've come to give life. How are you going to do that? How is he going to do that? Because we are under the death sentence. We haven't loved God. And so that's my next question. And that's what God ought, before I get to that question, that's what God ought to do with us. I mean, we've all disobeyed. We've all failed to love God. And it would be right for God to let us eat the fruit of failing to love him and be in a relationship with him, which is death. It would be right for him to let us all go to the grave and just die, and that be the end of it. And yet Jesus is here. I have come to give life. Okay, so we see then that loving God maintains life, and God uses representatives to do so. But now that death is in the world, obedience to God And loving God looks like something different, right? It doesn't look like what Adam and Eve had to do, right? They had it very easy. Everything was there for them. They had all their needs taken care of. There was no suffering. Just follow God. You'll maintain the life that he gave you. But now that death is in the world, you not only have to obey God in a world that is all set against God, but now you also have to take the death sentence upon yourself. Because God uses representatives. We'll get into this in a moment. I'm assuming when I say this that you guys know, and we'll get into that more in a second. But in order for somebody to be obedient to God, they must take the death sentence upon themselves. And I have the next question on the next slide. But so God is now alive. He's a life giver. We know that. So what is required for someone to willingly die for someone else? What do you think is required? What motivates somebody to willingly die for somebody else? Love, right? And to be clear, I might make this more clear in a second, but to make the point I'm going to have, God uses representatives. Adam was a representative for all mankind. Paul makes that very clear. Romans 5 and other places it says that as well. They were to represent humanity. When Adam sinned, all of us sinned and all of us died. And so God will now use another human representative, if anybody can, and this is what I think all the covenants are building up to. And by the way, which I love this, like Genesis 1 to 11 is actually just a miniature Old Testament within itself. What does God do? He comes to Adam and Eve. He gives them life in the garden. He gives them commandments. They disobey the commandments, and then what happens? They're kicked out the garden, and then what happens? Sin intensifies, and then they end up where? In Babylon, the Tower of Babel. And then what happens? God calls Israel. He gives them life. He gives them, he puts them in a new garden, so to speak, into Israel, and he gives them commandments. And when they disobey, sin intensifies, and then what happens? They end up in Babylon. It just repeats itself over again. I think Israel is a kind of a model of what they just repeat the pattern of humanity and Adam and Eve. But now God, all these covenants are set up to, if there is one king who will represent the nations, who will represent his own nation and represent the other nations, if he will be obedient on behalf of the people, he'll be like a new Adam, then God will give us life. Right? He will give life to everybody if this king can be obedient to God. And so that's the question is, who is that? And as you look at all the people in Israel who could have been obedient to God to give us life, who could you name? Was David good enough to give us life? Moses? No, right? All of them disobeyed, all of them failed, all of them sinned. So the question is, who then will do it? Who then is good enough to obey where Adam has failed? Who is good enough to be that human representative? And that's what the perplexing part of the New Testament is because God has to be the human representative. And as we looked at in Ezekiel a while back, this whole shepherd thing is it's the idea that there's going to be a human that's the shepherd, but also Yahweh says, I myself will be the shepherd of the sheep. And they come together in Jesus. So all that to say, now someone has to be obedient on our behalf so that we can live. We can't do it. We've all failed. And because of that, they also have to be perfect and take the death sentence on our behalf. They have to be obedient unto death. And so when we look at God, and God is going to come do this, all of us are under this sentence of death. Now, as we look at this, does God have enough love to take the death sentence on himself? That's the question we have to ask. We know that he wants to give life. He gave life in creation. But is his love enough to okay, I'll go to the grave for them to give them life? Is that what he wants to do? Is that what Jesus is saying when I've come to give life, that he's got so much love that he is willing to go to the grave? Is that what he's saying? If we were in a country let's just say we're visiting some country, and all of a sudden the officials in that country, they come up to us and we don't know why, we haven't done anything wrong, but unjustly, they just come and they handcuff us, they lock us up, they take us away, they throw away the key, but yet somehow we get the key. If you could give that, I know you can't leave that cell, but if you could give that key to anybody in the world, who would you want to have that key? What kind of person would you want to have that key? Yeah, I mean, would you want your enemy to have that key? No. So, well, there'd be a couple things. One, you would want somebody to have enough power and enough strength to be able to get to you, but also someone who has enough love motivating them to get to you. You want it to be in the hands of a loved one or a family member or something like that, someone who loves you, who will do whatever it takes to get to that cell and unlock it because they say you're going to be there forever. So you want it in the hands of someone who loves you. Well, we can take heart that God is willing to overcome death because the keys to life and death are in the hands of love. As John says, God is love. God is love. And so the question then is, since he has to take death, does God have enough love to overcome death? The question is yes. This is why John says things like, God is love. Death is no match for love's God, or God's love. And in eternity, you can just imagine this, because Jesus in a second is going to be speaking about this eternal, he's going to imply this eternal, this conversation that happened in eternity between the Father and the Son. Many other people have written about stuff like this. It's like it's a covenant or a contract sort of thing that's happening between the Father and Son before he came. And they both want to give life to the world, but now that after sin and death have come, the Father comes to the Son and he says, this is the bills of humanity. And in order for you to give them life now, here's the cost. You have to die. And the Father and Son come to an agreement that they are willing, that even death is not so great. It's no match for their love. And so it's no match for their desire to give life. Look at 10:17. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. So the Father loves that Jesus is going to love others and love others to death, right? Love people to death. He loves that Jesus is going to give his life. Now, he's going to say in a second, right after this, that no one takes it from me, but I give it of my own accord. I give it willingly. Now, he's not denying that this is still according to the Father's will, and this is still according to the Father's desire. As he is going to say in verse 18, this charge I have received from my Father. So he is going to death in obedience to the Father, right? This is Jesus still willingly doing it. He loves to do it, and yet he is doing it at the charge of his Father. Now, this is in other places in the New Testament, but there is an idea of being obedient unto death. When I was in the military, there was a lot of hard commandments that we had, and we didn't even do them like willingly. We went because we had to go, or there'd be trouble. But you think about, I think about some times that we had. There was 1 month, maybe even 2, where we slept like 2 or 3 hours every single night. We worked until midnight every night. Then we slept until some people didn't even shower, and then just went to bed and woke up at 3, and then we started work again all the way until midnight again. And we did that every night for a month or even 2 months. I can't even remember at this point. I think it was a couple months. And it was probably the hardest time in my entire life, like going off that much sleep after that long of time, that period of time. But even within the military, you might think about whenever we'd be commanded like to go into some dangerous place or something like that, people aren't necessarily being commanded to go die. You might think of an instance where something like that happens, but it's just the result of going into a dangerous place, right? You're commanded to go do this dangerous operation, and the result is death. So these are hard things to be obedient to. And they're not always willing, right? It's not like we want to do it. We don't desire to do this. Even that country song is playing in my head right now. I don't want to die for you. He doesn't desire to do it, right? That's the point in the song. He's not willingly doing it, right? He's just doing it. He'll do it with honor, but and as a command. Now think about the hardest commands you've ever gotten in your life. Now, I know this is like a weird situation, but just imagine you're a kid again, you love your father so much, and he wants you, some enemy you have, somebody that doesn't even like you, he wants you to give up your life by, this guy needs a heart transplant, he needs a heart, needs a new heart, and he wants you to give up your heart for this person. Would you be able to obey that? That would be so hard. That would be so difficult. And yet this is exactly what Jesus is doing. He is being obedient unto death. I have some text here. Philippians 2:8. I'll read it for you if it doesn't come up. And listen to this. And being found in human form. This is our human representative, right? Being found in human form. That's why Paul says it. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. So Jesus is being obedient to death. He is submitting to the Father's will, and he's doing it willingly. He loves to do it. He loves to go to death. Like it's crazy for us to think about, but he loves to do it. And he's being obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Romans 5:18 and 19. This is talking about Adam right here, and then Jesus. Therefore, as one trespass led to condemnation for all men, the one trespass of Adam, so one act of righteousness, Jesus' act of righteousness, leads to justification and life for all men. So there's one person, his sin that represents us leads to sin and death for everybody. There's one person whose life of righteousness, which is obedience to death, that leads to life for all people. Question is, who do you belong to? Who do you belong to? Are you in Adam or are you in Christ? Do you belong to Jesus or are you still in Adam? Whenever all of us are born, all of us are kids, everybody is born in Adam. We are still born with this corrupting, sinful nature that will bring us to death. And what most of humanity tries to do is they just say, oh, well, I got to try to be obedient. I got to try to love God and be obedient. And they think that their some kind of obedience and what they're doing for God is somehow going to earn them life. And it doesn't. As we've said, everybody has failed that. And what we see this morning is that Jesus is being obedient to the Father unto death on our behalf. He is overcoming death so that we can have life. And the way that you partake in that life is by believing in Jesus Christ. And so the question is, do you believe in Jesus Christ this morning? Do you love him? And if you do believe in Jesus Christ, he has made you alive. This has this new birth, right? Come alive. Now all of a sudden, you no longer love sin. You don't want to do these things anymore. You want to love God. You love his commandments. You love his ways because you now love God and you have this relationship with him. And so, and that's the point, is the way that you can tell in sanctification as we are growing in Christ, not to get into a relationship and have life with him, but within this relationship with him, the way that we know that we love God is if we are obeying him. And so both of those come together. Jesus obeys perfectly to secure life and to achieve life for us, but now that we have life, the fruit of that love for God is manifested in our obedience to him, right? You don't obey to receive life, you obey as a result of getting life. Probably the clearest way I can put it. You obey as a result of receiving life. So we've talked about, this will be very quick, but we talked about how Jesus is this charge I received from my Father. He's going to die. The Father loves Jesus' obedience. He loves that Jesus is laying down his life. You could say that this love that's being spoken about is the love that Jesus has for the Father. The reason he is coming to die to give us life is because he loves his Father and he is obeying his Father, right? So do you think that that means that Jesus loves us, or that can be applied to us? Do you think that Jesus coming to die has any motivation in his love for us at all? Yeah, you can say that, definitely. Jesus has a people in this world. If you look at verse 14, it says, I know my own, and my own know me. These are his people. These are his people that he loves. And when he loves, these are his people that he knows are under the sentence of death, and he will do anything for them. He will. There's no mountain that is not, too high for him to climb. There's no valley that he wouldn't love to be in for his people if it means securing life for us. And whenever the test of death is faced against him, he is lovingly coming to lay down his life for us because of his love for us. It's a motivation of a love for the Father, but also a motivation for love for us. Jesus is perfectly loving us. He's also perfectly loving the Father. Look at verse 13. Why does the hired hand bail whenever his own life is at risk and he no longer protect the sheep? What is the reason it gives in verse 13? Why does he leave? Why does he not protect the sheep? It says he cares nothing for the sheep. So what's implied? That Jesus, he doesn't bail. He lays down his life for the sheep. What's he saying? Because he cares greatly for the sheep. Because he loves the sheep. He loves his own people. There is a love that Jesus is obeying the Father and fulfilling his commandments, but there is also Jesus loving us to the grave as well. And as you go on in John, he's going to say, no love is greater than this, that he give up his life for his friends. And this is why we know that if you are in Jesus Christ and you have believed in him, that you belong to him. If you have had a new birth, you belong to Jesus. You have faith. You have love for him. You are his sheep. And this is why we know that no matter what life throws at us, that we will make it to the end. We will persevere through all the trials of life. And it's because Jesus is our shepherd. He has been sent, and he has willingly come so that we can have life, and he is going to make sure that we do have life. He has come, he's already done the hard part of dying, but now he's also going to do the hard part, the other part of making sure we don't do anything to fall away from him. He's going to make sure that we make it through all the trials that come with faith, and that we continue to believe in him and don't fall away. The point is, he wants to make sure that you live, and he's going to. And there's nothing that can be snatched out of his hand, as he's going to say in a little bit, or the Father's hand. And so, what we've seen this morning is, in the beginning, love is, and this is still all God's love, it's just manifested in different ways, but in the beginning, love is required, and love motivates God to give life. But after the fall, self-sacrificial love is what, costly love is what motivates God to give life again. Let's pray. Father, just ask anybody here that doesn't have life, that's not believing in Jesus Christ this morning, that you would